Welcome to a conversation about whether the modern world has stopped dreaming big. In this episode of Interesting Times, Ross Douthat sits down with Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal and Palantir, early backer of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, and arguably the most influential figure on the intellectual right of the past 20 years. The question running underneath everything they discuss is simple but unsettling. What should we fear more, catastrophe or stagnation? And why is one of the world's most successful investors worrying out loud about the Antichrist? The case for stagnation. Thiel's starting point is an essay he wrote roughly 13 years ago, called The End of the Future. Its argument was that the fast-paced, ever-changing modern world was not nearly as dynamic as people believed, that beneath the surface, we had entered a long period of technological stagnation. Digital life was a real breakthrough, but a smaller one than we had hoped, and in most other respects the world was stuck. In 2025, Thiel says he still broadly believes this. It was never an absolute claim. The point was that the velocity of progress had slowed, not stopped. From roughly 1750 to 1970, more than 2 centuries, change accelerated relentlessly. Ships, railroads, cars, and planes each got faster, culminating in the Concorde and the Apollo missions. Then, across many dimensions, things slowed down. The great exception was the world of bits, computers, software, the internet, mobile, and more recently crypto and the artificial intelligence revolution. The open question is whether that is enough to pull us out of a generalized sense of standstill. There is also a harder, almost philosophical problem. How do we even know whether we're stagnating or accelerating? Late modernity is hyper-specialized. You can't judge progress in physics unless you've spent half your life on string theory, and then you'd have to weigh that against quantum computing, cancer research, biotech, and countless other fields. The very fact that the question is so hard to answer, that we rely on ever narrower groups of experts guarding their own domains, is itself, to Thiel, a reason for skepticism. The Back to the Future test. The two men reach for a cultural yardstick, the Back to the Future films. The first jumped from 1955 to 1985, 30 years. The sequel jumped from 1985 to 2015 and imagined flying cars. The real 2015 looked nothing like that. Show a child of 2025 the world of 1985 and the cars look a little different and nobody has a phone, but the built environment feels broadly familiar. Contrast that with someone transported from 1890 to 1970, who would find themselves in a completely transformed world. That common sense gap is one of the strongest intuitive cases for stagnation. What would convince Thiel we had returned to real takeoff? Economic measures, mainly, whether living standards for a 30-year-old today match what their parents enjoyed at the same age, along with the rate of genuine intellectual breakthroughs. He points to sharply diminishing returns in science and academia. You have to pour more and more resources in to get the same output, which is part of why so many institutions feel, in his words, like sociopathic, Malthusian machines that eventually collapse when people give up. Why growth matters. Douthat presses the counter-argument that took hold in the Western world in the 1970s. Maybe we're rich enough, and pushing for much more growth will only degrade the planet. Thiel's answer is that stagnation happens for deep reasons. People ran out of ideas, institutions grew risk-averse, and there were some legitimate fears about accelerating toward environmental or nuclear catastrophe. But if we don't find a way back to the future, he believes society itself unravels. He defines the middle class as the people who expect their children to do better than themselves. When that expectation collapses, a middle-class society ceases to exist. Our institutions and our budgets are all predicated on growth. He describes Reagan-era consumer capitalism and Obama-era low-tax socialism as equally unstable arrangements. Sooner or later, either the taxes rise or the socialism ends. A genuinely no-growth future, he suggests, might not be North Korea, but it would be deeply oppressive. Decadence and the hunger for crisis. Douthat introduces a favorite theme, decadence. When a society feels stagnant and comfortable, people grow risk-averse, and some become almost eager for a crisis that lets them radically redirect things. His example is the aftermath of September 11th, when a certain foreign policy mindset treated the moment as a chance to shake off decadence and remake the world, with disastrous results. Thiel counters that the dominant response after September 11th wasn't anti-decadent at all. The president told everyone to go shopping. On risk, his instinct is directional and clear. We should be taking far more of it. His sharpest example is biotech. On dementia and Alzheimer's, he argues, we've made essentially zero progress in 40 or 50 years, stuck on the beta amyloid hypothesis, reinforcing a failed consensus. Immortality, cryonics, and early modernity. What would more risk in medicine actually look like? For someone with a fatal disease, Thiel says, there are many more risks worth taking for patients and researchers alike. Culturally, he wants to recover the spirit of early modernity, when thinkers like Francis Bacon and Condorcet genuinely expected science to conquer disease and deliver radical life extension, perhaps even in competition with Christianity's own promise of bodily resurrection. He recalls the year 2000 at PayPal, when a co-founder who believed in cryonics took the whole company to a freezing party, a kind of Tupperware party for people who wanted to freeze themselves. It was, he admits, a symptom of stagnation and of decline, because back then a fringe of baby boomers still believed science might let them live forever, and today, he says, essentially no millennial believes that anymore. Venture capital for politics. The conversation turns to Thiel's political turn in the 2010s, when he became the lone prominent Silicon Valley supporter of Donald Trump and backed a few Senate candidates, one of whom is now vice president. Douthat frames this as venture capital applied to politics, a bet on disruptive agents who might jolt the status quo. Thiel agrees, but describes layered and modest hopes. Part of him wanted to redirect the ship away from the iceberg. A narrower part simply wanted to reopen a conversation about whether America was still a great country, something a slogan like "Make America Great Again" both promised and quietly conceded. He had two thoughts in 2016 that he couldn't reconcile: that nobody would be angry at him if Trump lost, and that Trump had a 50-50 chance of winning. In hindsight, he calls the hope of a real national conversation a preposterous fantasy. The country wasn't ready, though he thinks we may finally be able to have it now. Silicon Valley changes its mind. By his account, Thiel spent the early 2010s debating figures like Eric Schmidt, Mark Andreessen, and Jeff Bezos, who all insisted everything was going great while he argued there was a stagnation problem. Over time, he thinks they've adjusted. And by 2024, a large part of Silicon Valley, most famously Elon Musk, swung behind Trump. Thiel links this to disillusionment, a default liberalism that, whenever it failed, simply demanded more of the same, until leaders had spent hundreds of millions of dollars, gone fully woke, and found themselves widely disliked, at which point some concluded it simply wasn't working. Douthat suggests populism became a vehicle for technological optimism. Thiel resists the sunny framing, warning that such optimists are being set up for disappointment. He still calls Trump-era populism the best option available, asking, pointedly, whether Harvard will cure dementia by puttering along as it has for 50 years. He worries, though, that populists don't actually care about science and may defund it out of spite. His deeper concern is that the machinery of science has stopped working. In the era of the New Deal, government pushed science hard and scaled it, whereas today, he jokes, if a modern Einstein wrote to the White House, the letter would be lost in the mailroom. A moonshot in the 1960s meant actually going to the moon. Today, the word signals something fictional that will never happen. The value of populism, in his telling, is partly deregulatory and deconstructive, clearing the field, tearing away illusions. But at some point, you have to move from clearing to building, whether that means new nuclear plants, better reactor designs, or even fusion. Asked why he has personally stopped funding politicians, Thiel calls himself schizophrenic on the subject. Politics is both incredibly important and incredibly toxic. It's toxic, he says, because it's zero-sum. The stakes feel enormous, and you end up with enemies you never had before. Mars as a political project. One of the episode's most striking passages concerns Elon Musk and Mars. Thiel recounts telling Musk, before the 2024 election, that if Trump lost, he wanted to leave the country, and Musk replying, "There's nowhere to go." 2 hours later, Thiel realized what that meant. Musk no longer truly believed in going to Mars, at least not as a political project. Mars was never meant to be merely a science experiment. It was supposed to be an alternative society, a fresh start. But Musk had come to believe that the socialist government and the woke AI would simply follow you there. Thiel traces this to a conversation he helped broker years earlier between Musk and Demis Hassabis of DeepMind. Hassabis said he was building the most important thing in the world, a superhuman AI. Musk answered that he was building the most important thing in the world, making humanity an interplanetary species. Hassabis replied that his AI would be able to follow Musk to Mars, and Musk went quiet. It took years, Thiel says, for that to fully sink in. How big is AI really? If everything else is stagnant, artificial intelligence is the great exception, the one clear zone of surprising progress, and one the Trump administration has favored through public-private partnerships. So what does Thiel, an AI investor, think he is investing in? His deliberately modest answer: AI is more than a nothing burger and less than the total transformation of society. His placeholder is that it's roughly on the scale of the internet in the late 1990s, enough to add perhaps a percentage point to annual growth for a decade or so, and to create some great companies, but perhaps not enough on its own to end the stagnation. It is, he admits, unhealthy that AI is the only game in town. He would prefer multidimensional progress, with cures for dementia and missions to Mars alongside it. But if AI is all we have, he'll take it. The limits of superintelligence. Thiel is a skeptic of what he calls the superintelligence cascade theory, the idea that once AI gets smart enough, it will hand us progress in the world of atoms too, curing disease and building the factories that build the rockets. He suspects raw intelligence hasn't actually been the gating factor. Silicon Valley, he argues, is fixated on IQ, yet very smart people often do worse, not better, because society doesn't know what to do with them and they don't fit in. That points to something culturally broken rather than a shortage of brainpower. His fear is a future where AI becomes itself stagnationist, highly capable but conformist, like a Netflix algorithm generating endless mediocre films and endless acceptable ideas, putting people out of work while deepening the standstill. Even so, he insists we should keep pushing AI, because the alternative is total stagnation. The very fact that AI is the only thing we talk about is, to him, an implicit admission that without it we'd be at a near-complete standstill. Transhumanism and the perfected body. Many people in AI, Douthit notes, hold a far more utopian, transhumanist view, seeing the technology as a path to transcending mortal flesh, creating a successor species, or merging mind and machine. Is that hype, delusion, or a real prospect? Thiel affirms he wants the human race to survive, but also wants us to radically solve these problems. He reframes transhumanism through a critique. Changing your clothes, or even your body, is pathetically little. The real ambition should be to transform the whole self. And here he invokes Orthodox Christianity, whose critique of transhumanism is not that it's unnatural, but that it doesn't go far enough. You must transform the soul, not just the body. He notes that the word nature never appears in the Old Testament, and reads the Judeo-Christian tradition as fundamentally about transcending and overcoming a fallen condition. Douthit's rejoinder is that in Christianity the perfected body and soul come through God's grace, while the person who tries to achieve it alone, with machines, tends to end up a dystopian figure. Thiel observes that the actual transhumanist project keeps shrinking. Cryonics feels like a relic of 1999, uploading feels like a step down from that. After all, he'd rather keep his body than be a computer program that merely simulates him. He recounts Musk predicting 1 billion humanoid robots in the United States within 10 years, and his own reply that if that were true, the budget deficit wouldn't matter because growth would swallow it. Yet Musk still worries about the deficit, which suggests he hasn't fully thought it through. Thiel's broader complaint is that Silicon Valley is bad at articulating what technology means. Debates collapse into microscopic questions, AI benchmark scores, the exact definition of AGI, while the crucial mid-level questions go unexamined. What AI means for the budget, the economy, and geopolitics. He offers one concrete example. Does an accelerating AI revolution deter China from invading Taiwan because they've already lost the race, or does it push them to strike now before they fall behind? Either way, it matters enormously, and it isn't being thought through. The Antichrist and the one-world state. The conversation builds toward the theme Thiel has been lecturing on, the Antichrist. He frames it through existential risk. The usual catastrophes, nuclear war, environmental disaster, bioweapons, rogue AI, almost always invite the same political solution: one world governance. To control nuclear weapons or dangerous AI, people propose a global authority with real teeth, even global compute governance that logs every keystroke. Thiel worries this is jumping from the frying pan into the fire. He sets two framings side by side. The atheist version is one world or none, a phrase from a late 1940s film by the Federation of American Scientists, which argued that only a world government could prevent nuclear annihilation. The Christian version is Antichrist or Armageddon, either the one-world state of the Antichrist or sleepwalking toward destruction. At one level, he says, they are the same question. Then he offers his key twist. The old Antichrist stories had a plot hole. The villain supposedly hypnotizes the world with demonic speeches, which is absurd. Thiel's resolution is that the real Antichrist would take power not by inventing a terrifying machine, but by talking endlessly about existential risk and the need to stop, to regulate, to keep us safe. In the 17th century, you might fear an evil genius, a Dr. Strangelove figure who builds a doomsday device. In our world, he argues, the figure with real political resonance is the opposite, someone more like Greta Thunberg, promising safety by halting progress. The modern Antichrist would say, come with me to avoid Skynet, to avoid nuclear Armageddon, and in exchange accept universal stagnation. The irony of the tools of control. Douthat pushes back on two fronts. First, he argues that to make that fear concrete, you would still need a genuine burst of technological progress, a new Los Alamos, that people could then be frightened into taming. 20th century totalitarianism failed partly because it couldn't actually know everything happening in the world, so you'd need advanced AI to enable the surveillance. Second, he turns the knife personally. Thiel invests in AI, in Palantir, in technologies of surveillance and warfare. Wouldn't a peace and safety Antichrist happily use exactly those tools? Wouldn't the irony of history be that the man publicly warning about the Antichrist helps hasten his arrival? Thiel replies that he obviously doesn't think that's what he's doing, and Douthat clarifies he doesn't think so either. He's simply interested in how a world talks itself into permanent authoritarian rule. Are we already living under it? Thiel's answer is that we may already be living under a mild version. For 50 years, he argues, the entire world has submitted to peace and safetyism, a phrase he draws from 1 Thessalonians, where peace and safety is the slogan that precedes sudden destruction. He points out that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration effectively regulates drugs for the whole world because other countries defer to it. The same is true of nuclear regulation, so that you can't simply design a modular reactor and build it in Argentina. So the 50-year stagnation has two possible explanations. Either we ran out of ideas, or something cultural and institutional made progress no longer allowed. A machinery of government, partly top-down, that converted the promise of nuclear power and other 21st century technologies into a permanent off-ramp. That leads to the final exchange about God and history. Douthat asks whether, in this telling, we're already under a moderate rule of the Antichrist, and whether God would really leave us there forever. Thiel resists too much determinism. He is, he says, not that Calvinist. Attributing all causation to God is a mistake, and he cites the verse in John where Christ says his persecutors hated me without cause, reading it as evidence that God is not behind everything that happens. There is always room, he insists, for human freedom and human choice. If these things were truly predetermined, you might as well do some yoga and prayerful meditation and wait for the lions to eat you. And that, he says, is precisely what we are not supposed to do. Douthat closes on that note of hope. In using your freedom to resist stagnation and the Antichrist alike, you should have real hope of succeeding. On that, at least, the two men agree.